Joining me now, Congressman Jason Smith of Missouri, who's the ranking member of the House Budget Committee. Jason, great to see you. This is a pathetic bill, as I've argued in my opening, and Senator Portman agrees. It's a pathetic bill. This is about big government socialism. It has nothing to do with economic growth or capitalism or freedom or liberty or any of that stuff. There's a bunch of things I'd like to know about. Here you've got whatever it's going to be, 450 billion of subsidies, green tax credits, and all the rest of that stuff. Does anybody really think that's going to do any good in terms of the global warming story? Does anyone think that's going to help electricity, power costs, gasoline costs? I mean, who are they kidding? This is just handouts. This is corporate pork. It has nothing to do with any of this stuff.
Larry, this bill is about rewarding their wealthy environmental friends and donors. More than 50% of all the spending in this piece of legislation goes exactly to do that. There's $250 billion worth of loans that they can just hand out. Have you ever heard of Solyndra? I mean, Larry, this is exactly the making. You see billions of dollars for tree equity, billions of dollars to implement every aspect of the Green New Deal, over $400 billion. This bill, if you take away the fake sunsets and the budget gimmicks, is going to cost the American taxpayers $745 billion. $745 billion. This administration, these Democrats, they believe that that you can spend your way out of an inflation crisis that they've created by all this reckless spending. I guess they also believe that they can tax ourselves out of a recession, since there's $613 billion worth of taxes in this horrible piece of legislation.
So, Jason Smith, there is no inflation reduction in this bill. I mean, that's been all these government models have said that. You're also adding to that, there's not going to be any deficit reduction. That promise is a lie. There's not going to be any debt reduction. That promise is a lie. And by the way, let me add one more, Jason. You know, Joe Manchin hanged a lot of his hat, said, well, the Democrats are going to give me a vote on faster permitting, including permitting for fossil fuels. Well, it was a Republican, it was Dan Sullivan's resolution that passed. Manchin voted for it. But every Democrat except for Manchin voted against it, and then the White House put out a veto message against it. So Manchin, he's not going to get his inflation reduction. He's not going to get his deficit reduction. He's not even going to get his permits, which was his biggest thing.
You know, Larry, it sounds like Senator Manchin bought some oceanfront property in Arizona, because clearly he's not getting what he apparently agreed to. This piece of legislation is opposite of everything that Senator Manchin said. Back in 2010, Senator Manchin said that in a time of a recession, you should never touch the tax code. And in fact, this is raising the taxes on hardworking Americans. More than 50% of the taxes in this bill are tax increases on people who make less than $400,000 a year. $17 billion alone just on people making less than $200,000. But guess what? The energy industry, they're getting taxed $12 billion. So that means every American is going to be paying more to fill up their car, to heat their homes, and to purchase that coal in West Virginia.
And, you know, so let's go with that, stay with that. This is, you know, regarded, what Al Gore said, this is the greatest thing to fight climate change, $450 billion in spending, whatever the number is. But wait a second. This is major steps in the attack and the war against fossil fuels. So we're supposed to go without fossil fuels in, let's see, this is 2022, Jason, in 8 years. As I understand it, no fossil fuel related electricity, either by 2030 or 2035. And then by 2050, no fossil fuel. Does anybody believe that? I mean, outside of this obsessive left-wing Democratic Party, ordinary people, men and women in business, consumers, they really believe that? People that work in the utility business, does anybody believe this stuff?
Larry, not at all. Everyday average Americans are just trying to put food on their table, clothes on their backs, and this legislation does the complete opposite. In fact, it makes their lives more difficult. It's only going to cause inflation to skyrocket more. Larry, Wednesday of this week, the new inflation numbers are going to come out. And what is the solution that the Democrats and Joe Biden have is to spend $745 billion more? You were talking about whether it decreases the deficit. The first 5 years after passage of this, it increases the debt $30 billion. And 90% of their so-called fake deficit reduction numbers doesn't even take an effect till after the year 2029, Larry. This is a joke. This is a sham. They're just trying to reward their political buddies with $700 billion worth of their greeny items right before the election. But let me tell you, the American voters aren't having it.
The social spending for Obamacare is going to cost $270-80 billion over 10 years. I'm amazed the CBO hasn't, scored that formally. And then, of course, a few weeks earlier, we had the CHIPS Plus bill, which is going to spend close to $300 billion over 10 years, right? So we're talking about $1 trillion. Trillion's not as bad as $5 trillion, but when you have an 8% inflation rate, $1 trillion is $1 trillion. Now, I just find this to be a head scratcher. I mean, there must be somebody in the Democratic Party who's willing to speak up on this. I mean, either spending is inflationary or it's not, Jason. It can't be inflationary last month and then counterinflationary this month. I'm sorry.
It doesn't make sense. But if you look at the items that people's getting for this spending, it's folks who make $300,000 a year that can get a tax credit to purchase a new electric vehicle. Obamacare subsidies for folks making $300,000 a year. It's not about helping working class families. In fact, working class families are the one that's paying for this with tax increases. It's absolutely unacceptable. They come up with a fake name saying it's the Inflation Reduction Act. No, Larry, this is the Inflation Expansion Act. It's a horrible bill, and anyone who's voted for this should be ashamed of themselves.
Yeah, it's a pathetic bill. But the Democratic Party has lost any semblance now of common sense. Manchin was bought off with nothing. Sinema was bought off. She got a little something on capital investment, okay, but still, they've lost any pretense. And you're right. It's going to be working folks who pay for this stuff. The working folks are going to be attacked by the IRS. The working folks are going to have to, the corporate tax hike is going to be paid for by working folks.
Larry, the 87,000 new IRS agents that are doubling the size of the IRS with the $80 billion that they've invested, you can just look at it. They're going to be going after those farmers. They're going to be going after those small businesses and those families because they want to make sure that those pennies in their couch cushions are being counted. And that is who they're going to be held accountable. It's not going to be the billionaires, which is unconscionable.
Yeah, and conservative groups. They're going to go after the conservative groups like they always do. Jason Smith, thank you, sir. We appreciate it very, very much. Talk soon.